And welcome back or welcome to the On Coaching Podcast. I'm Steve Magnus and joined as always by my good friend and colleague, John Marcus. John, what's going on, my man?
It's that time again. Time to give the people what they want, Stephen. And what do the people want?
You know, I think what they want is to learn how to suffer.
They're like
That's what our sport is about. That's what actually coaching is about, is how do we navigate through the adversity, the challenges, the just sometimes suckiness of figuring out how to make people perform. Well, we've got the answer, John.
We do. What is the answer, Steve?
It's do hard things.
Do
It's
hard things. There it is.
The new book. John, it's finally here. You know, I've been working on it for years. We've been having these conversations behind the scenes for years. And my new book, Do Hard Things, Why We Get Resilience Wrong, and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness, is finally out. So you can get your copy anywhere, wherever they sell books.
I like it because it's reframing this idea of like pain is weakness leaving the body, or the old Vince Lombardi, like we're gonna work them and work them and work them till they're dead mentality. That's so ingrained because hard things are hard, but they're not hard in the way we tend to think they are.
Exactly. And that's what I think, it's, again, these conversations we've had over the years is that we have this fundamental misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding gets in our way. Because when we see like, oh, like we've just got to grit our teeth and like, bulldoze through this pain and ignore everything around us and like never have any doubts and all that stuff. All it does is it creates discomfort being the enemy, when it's really just a part of your brain and body doing its job, right? We've talked about this before, but it's like your brain is protective. It's saying, when we go out and race, it's saying, hey, Steve, John, what in the world are you doing? Like, we're running low on glycogen. Like, our pH, this thing that measures that is our acidity in our body, is, we keep it finely regulated. What in the world are you doing pushing it out of our regulation?
Willfully. You're an insane
Willfully.
person.
Like, why are you creating all this acid in here that's creating this environment that is damaging things? What are you doing? So of course, like, your brain says, hey, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to sound the alarm. I'm going to tell you to slow down, to stop. And the way to get through those things isn't, again, to like always just put our head down, like fight, but it's to realize that that's just a signal. And we've got to be able to navigate those signals and sometimes listen to them and sometimes not. But as you and I know, one of the keys to running is learning how to navigate those signals. And when you coach high school, you learn this pretty quickly, because you get kids who come up to you and they're like, oh, I'm just in so much pain, coach. I'm in so much pain. I think this is hurt or whatever. And you're just like, you're just feeling soreness, man.
Yeah.
Like, this is part of it.
And that's what I love about the book, is this reinterpretation of, what people might call discomfort, or, we were talking offline here in the Science of Swimming, and very excellent old school swimming book. There's a little chart in there that has like introducing these concepts of the discomfort spectrum, where it's like injury, agony, pain, hurt, discomfort. And like a lot of people just lump them into one thing and like, this is not good. Oh, this is not comfortable. And anything that's not comfortable isn't interpreted as bad, as pain, as suffering, so to speak. But you have to put forth a little effort, or do a little hard work, where you start to touch on some of these things like discomfort or maybe a little bit of hurt. But you don't want to go to the point of like injury and agony. And a lot of times we get the signals crossed or just jumbled because of the lack of nuance that we have at interpreting this scale.
Yeah, I love that book, because it gets to one of our themes in this podcast, which is often the old school history, like, got a lot of things right.
Yeah.
without like understanding the full science and psychology that we do now. But decades later, what happens is the science backs this up.
Hmm.
Um, in They call it in the latest psychology, they've called it emotional granulation.
Okay. Very fancy name.
Fancy name, which essentially means you can slice and dice and split these apart. Not everything that, as you said, is pain or agony. Like there are differences and nuances in this. And it's actually really fascinating. The way they got to this was um by going out and studying again like tribes that were kind of still put together, and not and living in kind of an ancient world, and like quizzing them on what they were feeling and the emotions that they were feeling.
Hmm.
And what they found is there were a lot of commonalities, but there were also nuances where like different tribes, modern tribes, had like different words for describing various emotions that we don't have in English.
Hmm.
And what they found is that when they described like these feelings and emotions differently, it shifted their interpretation, right? And you see this all the way going back to the ancient Greeks, right? They had I forget off the top of my head, but something like 5 words for love,
Yeah.
which we
Hmm.
have 1 word for,
Because there are different
right?
types of love. Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And because of that, they interpreted and approached like love in a very different way than often our modern kind of like jumble it all together, all wrap it into one. And this is what love is, and we don't have that nuance to describe maybe the love of a significant other, but also of a friend or whatever have you. Like it's all, or of an experience, it's
Well, that's
all
why
the same
Philadelphia is
thing.
named Philadelphia. It's the city of brotherly love because filio in Greek means love between two people that's not sexual, but very, of high esteem and intimacy. But we don't have that. It's just purely love is a sexual thing and or a thing of bloodline. That's it.
Exactly. And like I love that example, and thanks for the Philly example, because like that gets at it perfectly, because the same thing applies to everything else we experience. If we can add context and nuance to it, we're going to be in a better place. So the example I like to use again, that any high school coach understands this, is that your new runners, when they first feel any sign of discomfort, it's like they panic and freak out.
Mm-hmm.
And they just think like, "Oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to feel this way. I've never felt this way." The expert runner, and that doesn't necessarily mean the fastest, just the person who has spent enough time in the crucible and like paid attention, they can discern. You and I can go out, since we've been running for so long, we can go out and do a workout and be like, "Hmm, well, this pain, what does that signal? Well, this just means like, hey, maybe I'm a little low on fuel and I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have enough like to eat beforehand." Or this pain or discomfort or whatever, like this means I'm about to cross like this threshold, and like lactate is going up and I can feel it essentially in my body, right? Or it it could mean like, and this is something you have to really learn as you age, that like first tinge of feeling or experience that is out of the ordinary, that might mean, oh, okay, like my calf isn't ready for this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like I've got to pull the plug because this is not a good spot. And it's really, again, that nuance of that experience that is so crucial, that allows you to make good decisions instead of just default to, again, jumbling it all together and panicking and freaking out.
Yeah, it's this idea of developing a vocabulary in our physical as well as emotional and mental literacy, right? And our interpretation of existence is only as good as our vocabulary. So a lot of people say, "Oh, experience is what matters. Experience, that's, where you get your education." But if your vocabulary is limited or does not grow, coupled with the experiences you have, the interpretation of those experiences can only go so far. So that's why concurrent continuous learning or developing this nuance or understanding of these different dimensions that exist within suffering and pain or doing things that are hard is really critical. Otherwise, it's just that kind of caveman mentality. Ugh, me no like, me no like. And if we stay if we stay there, we get, we go on that emotional cascade that tends to, have things like, say, the, as in a very extreme example in recent history, like the January 6th Capitol riot, where it's just a bunch of people were like really emotionally charged, and like some people are super smart, like doctors, lawyers, this and that, right? Some people weren't, but they fell into this like victim of the mob and the crowd, and then went and did something in the moment because the crowd essentially was like, oh, me no like, and they were spurred on by, figureheads who said, "We no like either. We want to win. We say we did not lose. We did not lose." And it just created this, social cognition in the moment that led to this, very egregious act on the, U.S. nation's capital. But it's an extreme example of that. But if we step back and have a better vocabulary and can actually frame it a little bit more appropriately with, you know, more nuanced and textualized uh, wording and definitions of what's going on, it just makes for a better overall experience and better overall interpretation and better overall then behavior and action consequently.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that example. Not to get political, but I think it's great because if you look at the neurobiology and neuroscience behind this, it's fascinating
Mm-hmm.
and taken away from, again, that mom mentality. But whenever we're under highly stressful situations or situations where it's like, you know, you've got all this group influencing you in one direction emotionally and dragging you towards this. Essentially, what happens is your amygdala, your emotional processing and threat sensing area in your brain, gets turned way the hell up.
Yeah.
And it says, like, threat, threat, like, sound the alarm. And it's a very, we're simplifying here, but it's a very basic, like, highly ingrained, like, ancient system.
Mm-hmm.
It's our fear system, right? Our emotion and fear system, which
Our
is
survival system keep us
exactly.
alive.
It like goes all the way back to when we're on the savannah, where it's like you're not high. We weren't highly processed and able to think things through. It was just like, lion,
Run.
run.
Big
Like,
boom, run. Like,
yeah.
get out of here.
Exactly. And that's what it does. It pushes us towards, like, very simple actions. And what is interesting is that, again, if you look at the neuroscience, is as that amygdala goes up, the more kind of evolved
Executive, yes,
the
functioning.
executive functions, they go down.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the amygdala says, "Nope, I'm in charge here. Executive functions turn off." So it is actually like we get dumber.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we are going back in our evolution to a time when our executive function was very minimal because our brain is in survival mode. And this is also why, taking out of, that capital context, but this is what happens when you're in any sort of stress. And this is why it's about, like, again, understanding the nuance of the experience so you don't spiral, but it's also understanding, okay, when I go in this, how do I keep my mind steady and calm and my head on instead of losing it towards this thing. And one of my favorite people I talked to in the book was a former athlete of mine who then went into the military,
Mm-hmm.
who was telling me all about the training they did and the crazy things. And I can't go into a lot of it, but one is you essentially get dropped off in the woods and told to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Steve, you have no idea how many people just lost their minds."
I believe it.
And these are people who are, again, trained, like, they're, quote unquote tough people, but it's like that survival instinct is strong. And the data backs this up. I found actually one study that looked at longtime soldiers and special forces. So these are the toughest of the tough. And they stick them in these simulated survival or war scenarios that feel incredibly realistic. And something I think the stat was 96% of them experienced disassociation,
Wow.
which disassociation is essentially when your perception system goes haywire. You're in the fog of war. You literally sometimes, I think over half of them imagined things happening.
Hmm.
There was something like 65% of them like couldn't recall what happened whatsoever after or account for the actions that they were taking because people were monitoring them. They couldn't explain why they did things. And that these are again people prepared for it. So whenever I hear people and they're like, "Oh, like yeah, I can handle like difficult moments and all that stuff and pressure and stuff." I just think of that study because I'm like, here are again some special forces who just are trained for this stuff and their brain still goes haywire. So instead of like ignoring the problem and being like, "Yeah, no problem. I'll show up." Um maybe one more example to, drive this home that is top of mind, and I promise I'm not getting political, but all the people who my wife is a teacher, so when the unfortunate last mass shooting happened in Uvalde, in Texas, where my wife and I live, I remember all these people and politicians were like, "Oh, we should arm teachers. We should
Oh
arm
yeah,
teachers."
Jesus, yes. Whew.
And my wife and I had this conversation. Then I had this conversation again with people in the police and military, and they're like, and I referenced this study I just went over. I'm like, I don't think people understand like stress. Like they think that we're like Rambo or John Wick.
Right.
And the reality is our brain and body are designed for protection.
Mm.
So it's designed to essentially disassociate because it's like protecting us and saying, "What are you doing? Get the hell out of here, play dead or run away." And like if you give people who especially aren't trained for any of that experience, aka teachers, like what in the world do you think's going to happen when they feel stress?
Right.
And the point isn't to say like, "Oh, here's this politics." It's to say that for whatever, and this is where I get in the book is that we have this fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be tough, partly because we hold on to these ideas almost from movies that like, "Oh yeah, if I get thrown in this horrible situation, like I'm gonna be Rambo. That's me." And it's like that's not how it works in the real world. So we might as well figure out how it actually works in the real world and how we can deal with it.
Yes, entertainment unfortunately is a very poor educator because it's fantasy land. Okay? It's just made up. But unfortunately, a lot of education we get is via entertainment, and that's sometimes I think we have to understand too. Like doing hard things or doing difficult things or suffering is not just physical. It's also uh, related to your ego, also related to your position in the world, also related to your feeling of like efficacy and ability to sustainably do something, right? And having that illusion of control over your life. We see this all the time, especially in running. Like for me, when Steve talked about his title of his book, Doing Hard Things, I go, oh, that made perfect sense to me because my hard thing of late has been going deep into running biomechanics and understanding the really subtle nuances of it to the point of saying, look, it's kind of foolish to actually train how we're training and work with people at a high level and ask them to run however many miles a week, however many tough workouts a week, however many this and that, and then have they only improve by maybe half a second or a second or 2 seconds, depending on the race distance, like on the track per year. This is crazy. It is literally insane. It's like, if you think about it, like, why would you want to work more and work harder for a 5 cent pay raise once a month, like, once a year? It makes no sense. But because we are so focused on muscle physiology and it's easy to measure, easy to track, easy to understand and interpret, we tend to think that's the game we're always playing in distance running training, when actually a really high influence is on technique, a really high influence is on how the body can interpret and economize technique and running with understanding better the muscle tendon unit, the fascial system, and most importantly, like the reflexes, right? The stumble reflex and the cossack sensor reflex. So this took me about 4 years to like decode, unpack, develop. And right now, like in the Scholar program in the Clubhouse, we're running a mini course live on the what we call in quote unquote the perfect stride. Even though perfect's impossible, we call it, more refined, correct, reactive or reflexive technique where you're actually running with more quote unquote bounce in the stride versus more muscle in the stride. So if you haven't joined the Scholar program, please do, because you get access to this. That will really help level up your athletes. But it was really tough to talk to athletes and be like, hey, look, I think we should go in this direction and we should really focus on this because we can continue to try to build a better boat, but it's only going to be so good and go so fast. Rather, we should just we should build an airplane. But when you talk to people who the only concept is like the boat, the boat, the boat, and you talk about this new thing called an airplane, you go, you're insane, you're crazy, that's impossible, we can't do that, but we can build a better boat. That's really hard in a lot of ways for ego as well, for both the person who is presenting it and the person who's receiving it, because essentially it's kind of like Tiger Woods having to interpret or readjust his swinging mechanics because the club head and the ball and the golf ball dynamics changed, or anytime anyone else tries to change their mechanics that are super successful, go, why are you changing how you're pitching, why are you changing how you're throwing the football? Well, because they get to an impasse and they realize I could continue to muscle it and do it like this, but as we saw, like say with Tim Tebow and his throwing mechanics, he could get away with it at the college level and be really successful because the timing and speed and accuracy and coordination of it relative to the caliber of defensive players at the college level was adequate. But once he got to the pro level, it was inadequate. He was essentially holding the ball too long and allowing that extra fraction of a second would allow either defending backs to get in position to pick off or quote unquote telepath his throw and get an interception or have him get sacked. And so these things are hard because most people will look at someone who's already super successful and say, why do you need to change? When the super successful person or the people in the arena at that elevation are like, no, this is not sustainable.
I'm glad you brought that up because it absolutely is it's not just the physical stuff, it's that essentially I like to think of it as whenever in life we face something where it's like you have these different paths and one is easy, right? It's like, oh, why change things? Like they're already successful, like that's great. And then that other path is you glance over and you're like, ah, this might be the right path, but it's going to be really tough to go down.
Right. Yeah.
And I think far too often we just default to, okay, I'm just going to go down the easy one.
Just keep
When
build a better
we've
boat.
Yep, we've got to look over here and be like, okay, what is this airplane? Every once in a while. Now it doesn't mean you have to go down it, but it means you have to consider it. And I think what I look at again in the book and elsewhere is the things that you just looked at or you just talked about is it's not just, okay, how do I create the space to like get through that difficult moment in running? It's also how do I create the environment so that I can take on that challenge and go down that hard path if that's the right way to go. And I think you nailed it when you talked about ego, control, and efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's briefly talk about these. Ego. What does your ego do? It just gets in it just tells you to take the easy path.
Yeah.
Like we've talked about our brain being in protective mode and, physical things, but it's also psychological things. Because your ego, you know, if our ego presents or prevents us from doing difficult psychological things because it's like why put us in this position, why go up on stage, or John, I know you've thought about this a lot, why put out a podcast, why go on Twitter and say things that you're thinking and considering when you could get lambasted at, you could get attacked.
Right.
And your ego, I'm sure, and I'd actually love to hear you talk about this because part of your ego is probably telling you like, oh, like I don't want to get roasted on Twitter or Let's Run or wherever anymore. But then the other part of you is like, hey, I'm not sure about this, what you say, but like this could really help a high school coach or a college coach. So I need to put this information out there so that like there's a counter voice out there for people to consider.
Yeah, I mean, most times a lot of like the tweets that go quote unquote viral for the wrong reason get grossly misinterpreted because of the person interpreting it, right? And then everyone kind of mob mentality being like in this comment culture we live in now, and cancel culture being like, oh, boo 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 boo, right? But the reality is like Twitter is a place for sharing ideas, and that's what I love about it is that you can just share the idea. And I'll have people who will text me and be like, "Whoa, man, you just got roasted on Twitter." I'm like, I didn't check. I didn't check. One defense mechanism is I tweet and leave it and don't come back for
Mm,
like a couple days. Like I'm not, so I have no notifications about Twitter on my phone, no whatever. I only engage in Twitter when I'm in the actual app or website, and it's literally like 5 minutes a day, if that. And it's tweet and come back, tweet and come back, and I go on with my life, right? And then I come back and I go, oh, this seemed to hit a nerve. And that's really what I'm looking for, is like, do people understand or are they misunderstanding, and does it hit a nerve? And the nerve is then a signal for me to be like, all right, there might be something here because there's a lot of friction or misunderstanding. There's no desire to like, kind of gaslight anyone or anything. It's just like, this actually might be really important, but we're
mm,
misinterpreting it. And the problem is like, it's the mentality of the mob, right? So like we have examples of world-class Kenyan runners who, especially in the middle distances, who literally worked out every day. Or we have examples of Igloy, literally worked out every day. Jim Ryan worked out every day on the track, running reps every day. How are they doing this? Because muscle physiology says, well, you break down the muscle tissue and you have to recover. It's impossible. You can't do this. But, but, but it's the circumstances of which we're breaking down the muscle, because if you're running more reactively, you have isometric contractions that are engaged at the spinal cord level, not the voluntary cranial level. And so that short stretching cycle is actually very safe. And then, too, if you're working in the right time periods of that short stretching cycle, or in that reactive space, whether it's up to 60 seconds with a break or some type of recovery, well, then it's actually more quote unquote uh, hitting the central nervous system. And we know that central fatigue has a lot shorter time horizon than peripheral or muscle fatigue. So
mm,
muscle fatigue is very slow. So yeah, you got to do all these things to recover the tissue because you broke it down by going for a steady state 2 hour long run. So now you got 3-4 days of recovery ahead of you with a lot of nutrient intake. And we know that protocol really, really well. But from central fatigue, you can come back. You'll be kind of tired, like dozy, like, oh, I need to sleep. I feel kind of foggy. But then you go to sleep, take some recovery, and can come back in 4 to 5 hours, and you can rock and roll again. And this is exactly what you saw Igloy do, with double workouts on the track every day for six days, with a day off. And this is exactly what you're seeing with these Kenyan athletes do. And so because we think the only way to create motion is through the basic anatomy concept of muscle moves bone, and that's it. Like, it's a very rudimentary concept, right? Because there's a lot more sophistication in the human body, a lot more complexity than that. There's other mechanisms that are acaloric, that are really, really fast. Like the fascial mechanism is like speed of sound. Like, muscle contraction from the brain is about 150 to 250 miles an hour. Speed of sound is 761 miles an hour. I'm going to take the faster one that's acaloric. But again, when I present these ideas that might seem kind of contrary, I'm really testing and saying, all right, are people even aware of this? Is it on anyone's radar? And then that's the point of conception. And then also, like, where I actually lean in is when I do get a lot of friction and feedback, because like, oh, people are unaware or unwilling to hear this potential alternative. And it takes a lot of humility. Your ego, that's the key thing that gets in the way of the ego, is lack of humility. You have to be okay to be wrong. And it's not so much like wrong in the absolute sense, but wrong as in, I took a wrong turn. And we might have taken a wrong turn with overemphasis of muscle physiology with training for distance running. Now, it should be definitely, you have to train metabolics for sure, but you also have to be hypersensitive and attuned to mechanics. And that's where we lack the nuance at the moment in distance running is this mechanics, because you read all this stuff and it's like very, very general, glossed over. Like I read like running cross country successfully, and it's like it gives us little mechanics things like you should watch YouTube videos of Galen Rupp and Shalane Flanagan because they're really efficient runners and run like them. And like that was it. That was the thing on mechanics. I was like, what? Because it's interesting. In again, going back to the science of swimming, they actually provide this nice little chart, and we know this. It's been well, the science on it is pretty straightforward, or is pretty timeless. Is novice or poor athletes recruit more muscles at the wrong time that are more what we should call the assistant muscles than
Mhm.
actually the more expert athlete who recruits at the right time the bigger global muscles. And so they showed this in like say a champion swimmer and then an amateur swimmer, and the amateur swimmer would recruit like more of like the biceps brachii and the forearm muscles, but the expert swimmer would be recruiting the lats and more the deltoids, like the bigger muscles earlier on. And so to make up, that's the thing about muscle, which is really interesting, is it's a corrective mechanism. And if you recruit the wrong thing at the wrong time, your body is designed with backups and backups and backups to help facilitate or put a like safe gap or plug hole in it. But it's not sustainable over the long haul. It's just like an oh shit mechanism. Hey, I have this other smaller set of muscles that I'm going to use to now bring the forearm back or bring the leg up. But don't ask me to do this over the long haul, because what happens is overuse injuries, or what should probably better be called misuse injuries.
Yeah, I love that, and I think one of the things that you said in there that really gets to okay, how do we go down these paths where we explore is being okay being wrong.
Hmm.
And in the book I talk about that as well as you have to accept that sometimes you need to quit.
Yeah.
Because like what that does is it frees you up because what you're essentially doing is disentangling your ego. Because if you're okay being wrong, then you're not, or you're okay with sometimes you have to quit, you almost free yourself up because you're saying, okay, like my ego is not going to go into full protective mode where if someone tells me I'm wrong, I'm going to fire back and be like, "No, I'm not. You're wrong." And like take the kind of kid approach, which is often what we do. And I think again that gets to almost what I'd call like it's not getting rid of your ego, but it's how do we quiet it down,
Hmm.
right? How do we get a quiet ego so that we can get out of our own way and get and do the difficult thing or take on the difficult challenge or like say the thing that might be a little bit controversial but may allow us to learn, grow, and develop and might help other people. And a large part of that is getting your ego out of the way. And sadly, and this gets to another point that I think is important that you mentioned and that I talk a lot about in the book, is that this sense of efficacy, which is essentially like, can you handle the challenge before you? Do you have the confidence and wherewithal to be able to navigate or cope with whatever is in front of you? And similar to how our modern world gets the ego wrong and essentially tries to like stroke it and like grow it, we do the same thing with this sense of self-efficacy, which is we often focus so much on the external and it's almost like this Instagramification of our efficacy where so much of it is dependent on I'm going to create this like image of myself as being confident or having self-efficacy. I'm going to rely on these external barometers, these people to tell me that I'm great, or these likes or retweets or follows to tell me that I'm an expert at what I am, instead of relying on what really creates efficacy, which is like the inner belief and inner strength of knowing that like I've I've spent time researching and wrestling with this idea. I've gone deep and tried to explore as many avenues as possible. For example, in this like biomechanics or physiology to understand it. I've done the work to experiment, to test, to try these ideas to see, is there any there, or in our running. I've put in the work consistently for months and months to give me the self confidence to know that if I show up on race day, I'm prepared to compete, whatever compete means. And I think if we can get back to that confidence needs evidence, that efficacy is developed in doing the work, we're in a much better place than our current spot, which society just kind of pulls us towards, like, oh, just post some stuff on Instagram and you'll be great.
And this is the hard, this is going back to doing hard things again, and more the emotional mental side of it is the scientific method is a method of falsification. You are actively seeking circumstances in which this kind of theory or hypothesis you have is falsified. Versus we live in a world of biases and confirmation and verification. We only seek out, the circumstances or conditions of which things are confirmed, and then we bias our opinion towards that and saying, well, see, it's right, it's right, and it's go, well, when and where and is it wrong? And that's, I think, the hard thing about the ego. The ego wants to be quote unquote right because we're taught from an early age that those who are right get the spoils, good grades, good opportunities, good job, good, versus the reality is science and life is about being okay with being wrong for now, because all information, all knowledge is provisional. And we forget that. Like for a long time, we thought that the earth revolved around the sun, and we hung people, locked them up. I mean, even the fact that Darwin for 20 years, think about it, for 20 years, Darwin was sitting on the theory of evolution. It's like, I can't share this. If I share this, they will crucify me. Like, I will wait until my deathbed. But that's the thing, because we have a mode of operation, where we want to feel this cognitive, we don't like cognitive dissonance, right? We like, cognitive, stillness, where it's like, this is the way things are, and the way things are is the way they are, and I have this control and dependency, and I can depend on it, because that's what people love in everything, right? Like the number one rule of any relationship is trust, is consistency. Always just do the same thing all the time, and so then people can expect this is the way it is. But the reality is life, people, circumstances, the hard thing is accepting this fluctuation that happens, and this new chapters, this ebb and flow, this yin and yang. That's what a lot of the Eastern, philosophies really got it right, in my opinion, was this concept of, like, in Buddhism, you have to suffer, you have to get away from suffering, you have to deal with the suffering, you have to look at point blank, like, you have to understand that this life samsara and the suffering cycle is something to be overcame and, interpreted, and you use that as a tether, you use that as, your beacon to help you, rather than what we do in our culture is ignore. We tend to just ignore anything that does not confirm or is not, pleasing to us, and so we outcast it, when it's like, no, we should actually really really have this be an ingredient in our interpretation of reality versus something to just throw out.
I'm thrilled that you brought up Darwin, because I love his example. Because, like, he literally did sit on this evidence for like 20
I
years.
know, I can't
A-
believe it.
and it's wild too, is if you know also his relationship with his wife was like devoutly religious. Um, so he has to navigate, like, not only what this will do in the world, but also what it does in his own family. And eventually he got to a place where it's like, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing his work, but it's like, the evidence demands it. I've got
Mm-hmm.
to put it out.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at, going back, and this is where I love, speaking of doing hard things outside of athletic world, but you look at, the astronomers like Galileo, who said, hey, yo, we got it wrong. The earth revolves around the sun. We're
Mm-hmm.
not the center of the universe. And the absolute, like, horror and terror that they had to face from, society
I
and
mean,
to have to
Galileo got locked
question it.
up.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's just crazy, but it's like, well, how do you get to that point? Well, it's again, they did the work. They're like, "No, I've run this, Darwin's case for 20 years. No, Galileo, like I've studied this.
I've
Like
tried to falsify it, like, they
justify it.
tried to falsify it, like, with
I
me, with mechanics, like, I tried to falsify it, like, that was the thing that just bugged the crap out of me as I moved up from a high school coach to a professional coach was, like, at every level, the better movers were the better athletes, the faster athletes, the more consistent athletes, as we've talked in this podcast so many times, there's so many different workout methods or things you can do, but there's a really actually tight tolerance of correct technique. And the people who have more correct technique time and time again are the victors. And like I broke this down in the Scholar program of the women's 10,000 meters in Eugene this year, contrasting like say, a Steph Bruce who has a certain movement profile with like the winner, Carissa Schweitzer, who finished a minute ahead of her, and it's just a comparison of who is more in the range of correct technique in terms of getting more reaction from every step versus having to basically reaccelerate every step. And it's a spectrum, but time and time again, both altitude do a lot of altitude training, both do a lot of miles, but all do this. So why is this person that far ahead of that other person? And it just drove me freaking nuts to the point of being like, well, I observed this thing time and time again to the point of where I had to investigate. And that's
yeah,
really the thing of it is observation investigation.
yeah, and that's what it is, and I think that's again what comes down to like sometimes taking the hard choice is like you got to be okay with being like you've got to like almost try and falsify things. You've got to play counter, intuitive counter narrative. And I experienced this. You got to be okay also with the consequences.
Yeah.
It's like Galileo knew what he was getting into. Like, you read biographies and or histories of his time is like he knew, like not fully, we never fully know, but Darwin was aware of his, what could occur. Whenever I've been in very difficult situations, for instance, like blowing the
Oh
whistle.
shit, yeah, dude.
Yeah, like you remember, like
Yeah.
we've had all sorts of conversations like all the way back in the day of like, well, what if this happens? Well, just be ready for this. And
hmm
that's part of it, which is often when we take on difficult challenges, it's like we're told like, "Oh, be optimistic, like, come in like fake it till you make it, have this confidence." But the reality is you don't want to be delusional. You want to face the thing that you're going to face.
Yep.
You want to know what the crucible is and know that okay, yes, this is going to be really demanding, but I have the tools and capabilities to do so. Or on the flip side, which I think is what we get with Galileo, it's what we get, with my own whistleblowing, is sometimes something that is more important, greater than you, has more meaning than you, like is the force behind you that drives it. In my own experience, it was, I'm trying to get ahead by whistleblowing. I was like, this freaking sucks. And all these people are in this spot, um, and people are getting cheated in sport. And this sucks. Like, it doesn't suck just for me, it sucks for other people losing out. And then I remember,
And then
I
it
mean,
also it just even sucks like getting other people to get on board to help you whistleblow. I mean, there
yes.
was
Yeah.
like shit. I mean, the amount of people who knew what was going on and elected to say, "Oh, no, 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 I'm not gonna. It's too powerful. It's too big. I'm out. I'm out. I'm out." And you're like, but why? You could help. I mean, that was the more frustrating part for me was, seeing all the people who wouldn't step to the line, essentially.
Yeah, and that is part of why I wrote this book is essentially not it's like why don't we step to the line? Like I wasn't the only person who knew. I wasn't the only and even greater example and you're aware of this is as well is like with the Mary Kane allegations and
Oh
stuff
shit, yeah.
like no offense but this was like not everything but like this was the open secret in track and field because people watched like much of the verbal abuse at least
Yeah.
in
It was
at
blatant.
it was blatant, it was at practice, it was after races, like, you could see and hear this stuff, but no one and this was with, again, for, much of it, a teenage girl,
Yeah.
but no one stood up. No one said like, "Hey, this is really messed up." And I think that is, again, why? Because the easier path is to be like, it's too big of a problem. It's not my problem. Like, someone else will deal with it.
Mhm.
And I think this is where, again, where this book gets is, yes, it's about like how do we handle difficult moments in running, but it's also about how do we find that courage to be like, you know what? I've got to stand up. I've got to say something. And like giving us that freedom to do so. And that's what it is beyond the like I mean, it's almost like the running part is simple. It's like, how do you handle pain and suffering? Well,
Mhm.
here are some tips and skills. How do you stand up and say something when the world is shouting at you to sit down? That's the difficult moment. That's the part where I think we all have to like wrestle with and ask that question.
Right. I mean, I even remember like when you were whistleblowing, like talking about doing hard things, like people will come at you who were in the arena, who are just observers, fans, random people on Twitter, and just, attack you and your credibility and what you're doing and what you stood for because you're trying to quote unquote like tear down, this figurehead who they had this, again, media entertainment concept interpretation of what they were and what they stood for when the reality was the exact inverse, right? And that is also frustrating too, is having those voices that are there and trying to hold you back and, say shame on you, this person doesn't deserve it, when the reality is you were compelled to, you know, bring the evidence to light, like Darwin. And that's what the thing is like what compels you and why does it compel you? For me, the biggest frustration, right, is always seeing an athlete who is very compelled to do well and get the most out of themselves, but keep hitting an injury wall, keep hitting a movement ceiling wall, right? Because you can work someone's metabolics and movement profile all you want, but you will reach a movement ceiling if it's not addressed. And again, uh, you know, no coaching is better than poor coaching, right? So that's why, like, you see these studies where it's like in running, where a lot of seasoned runners, quote unquote, naturally develop the most economic technique for them, and interventions might prove to be, um, you know, detrimental by coaching intervention or cueing. But that's the thing we have to remember: is it good coaching or is it poor coaching? And a lot of people are smart enough to be like, hey, I don't know anything about technique, I don't know anything about it, so I'm just going to let it be, and we're just going to hope for the best. And that's the better path than an incorrect intervention. But at the same time, too, if you're not compelled to go seek out and understand or bring to light the evidence that you've discovered and start to, quote unquote, that you've connected the dots through, then actually not just you and your little cohort, but almost everyone around you is poor for it.
Exactly. And that's that's kind of what it is it's like we have too much of just like sitting back. And as I unpack this in the book and think about it, is it's also, or way back early on, you mentioned like this sense of control. And I think what happens is we get to this point where we're almost like apathetic and we feel like we have no control.
Yes, this the I call it the valley of frustration.
Yeah, yeah, where you're and that's kind of like where people put us in, and it's like, this was so much, I heard this so much while whistleblowing. It's like, well, I'd love to do this, but what's the point? Like, I have no power, and, like, my voice doesn't matter because we're going up against Goliath or whatever have you. And I get that sentiment, but whenever you live in that world where it's like you've essentially given away control, you're in that valley of frustration when you're saying, "Up, so what? What's the point?" Well, you're never going to do anything difficult when apathy or "what's the point" is the dominating message or narrative.
Mhm.
So you have to find ways to like take back that sense of control and find it and figure out, okay, you're right. This is going to be very difficult, but what can I do? Will it make even the smallest of difference? And again, bringing it back full circle to whistleblowing, I remember me and you having these conversations when, people like Mary Kane would joined the Oregon Project or others, and we'd just be like, oh God, this
Mm,
is going to be a disaster.
yeah. I mean, and other coaches too would just be like,
Yeah,
"What the hell?"
yeah, and other people, like, we talk to them, they'd be like, "Oh gosh, this is a disaster." Well, one of the things that, again, pushed me forward is I remember having those conversations and just being like, "Well, you know what? I can do something. It might not be perfect, it might not be the solution, but, like, I can report something so that in even if nothing happens, at least people are aware, right? And the information is out there to be able to, you know, maybe have a little second guess of, huh.
Mhm.
And it's funny because it took years, but it like if you talk to Mary or like look at what she did, like what finally pushed her over the edge was like the leaked USADA report that laid everything out there.
Right, yeah.
And that was the impetus to give her the courage to be able to like, oh wait, I experienced some crazy stuff. So, like that again, it took years, but that doesn't occur unless, myself and Kara Goucher and others, um, Danny Mackey and others who like blew the whistle at various points, like that helped save and shift a culture. So in your own life, I want you to think about those things where it's like, this might be really difficult, but it allows you to just nudge or shift that culture where you might be saving someone for going down this path that almost society encourages because like we all want to win and achieve, but like that you have safeguards on now because you stood up and stepped forward.
And part of that frustration, that value of frustration, is inherent in the art of suffering. It's being in there and feeling like a doldrum. It's feeling like things aren't making traction, and you're questioning: do you quit the path, or do you go and quit the journey? Right? Because sometimes, like you said before, you got to know when to quit the path and just say this is a dead end. But the journey does not end, right? Versus, we're not advocating for people to be martyrs here and say, oh, I got to sacrifice everything for the greater good and put myself out on the cross. But I'm reminded of how long we waited for the whistle or the hammer to come down. And if you remember, like we get like a little tip. Oh, they're gonna bring the hammer down here, and then it didn't happen. You're like, oh, and then you'd wait. Oh, they're gonna bring the hammer down here. It didn't happen. You're like, oh, and for years, this was years, right? It
Yeah.
must have been how people felt in the Lance Armstrong saga, where like everyone on the inside understood what they were seeing was not reality, and it was very, very maliciously manipulated, right? And just waiting and waiting and waiting. But the thing was, when the hammer did finally come down, it was airtight. And that's the thing sometimes you got to remember is a lot of the struggles, a lot of the first draft, second draft, 10th draft, 20th drafts, 100th drafts, like part of the mechanic stuff, right, is I've done, almost 1,000 by 400 meters on my own treadmill in my house with video, trying to like get this mechanical thing right, getting the triggers of these reflexes, getting the right positions of the limbs, getting the right position of the axial skeleton, the right movement patterns, the, minimizing the amount of rotation. But it's been like 1,000 times 400 meters. I just take my little video on my iPhone, hit record. I run 400 meters trying to work on one thing. And it's just been over frustrating, frustrating, frustrating. But over time, over the course of many years, those 1,000 by quarter have added up to the place where I am now, where it's like I can quickly, succinctly break it down with a lot more intelligence than before. Now, is it perfect? Is it 100% right? No, because movement is complex. The human body is complex. That means there's a lot of unknown knowns or unknown unknowns. There's a lot of things that are complicated about, which are known knowns that we can put together. But you've got to be okay with that value of frustration, because it's a key part of doing hard things. And without it, without that suffering of impatience or that suffering that comes from like the immediacy of like favorable results, you just, it's not really hard at that point. It's just, you're just looking for the easy way out.
Exactly, and I think that's what it is. If if I could summarize things up, it's like there's always that easy path. In running, it is the voice in your head that says, like, slow down,
Yeah.
right? Like, find a hole to step in at the worst, but it's like that voice that says slow down. That's the easy path.
I used
And
to
what do we
actually fun part is like just I used to
yeah,
have that after in every race that mattered when I was competing,
yeah.
collegiately. That would be one thought that go through my head on the warm up. Just step in a hole so you don't have to do this.
Exactly. It's crazy how many people, like, thought that same thing.
Yeah.
That's a on my college team, we literally called it, like, step in hole moments.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you don't talk about it, everybody thinks like, "Oh, man, I'm weak. Like, I have this I wanna step in the hole." It's like, "No, that's normal, man. Everybody has it." And I think that's part of this entire message that I'm trying to get across in this book is that whether you're looking at challenges in athletics, such as running, or you're looking at broadening it out to life of like making difficult choices like whistleblowing or whatever have you, like we got to work with reality, which is reality is we're all going to want to find that hole to step in.
Hmm.
And it's not about that old school of like, the old school football, like, oh, like that's weak. If you have that doubt or if you want to step in the hole, you're weak. No, man, it happens to everybody. So it's about accepting that and then figuring out, okay, how are we going to get on the other side? How are we going to get through this? How are we going to get to the starting line and then get in a place where we can compete? How are we going to get through those difficult moments where we can compete and like flip the switch to take control when it feels like, oh, what's the point? I'm suffering so much or what have you. That's what it's all about. And that's, again, here's my pitch for the book. That's what the book, Do Hard Things, is all about. So if you find yourself, this is a running podcast, if you find yourself struggling and running in any of those areas, I try and go deep on the science, the psychology, and then more important, the practical tips and takeaways that have worked for world-class athletes, by the way, and
Mm.
high schoolers and college athletes. I give examples and stories. Um, and to do the difficult things. If you're a coach who's listening, who's saying, well, I don't need that for my running, it goes well beyond that. It goes into the stuff that we talked about. How do you find the efficacy, the self control, the perception of control? How do you quiet your ego so that you can make the tough decisions in your life that set you up to not just survive, but thrive?
What I like about the book, Steve, is I felt like, after reading it, it completed the canon of, Alex Hutchinson's Endure and Matt Fitzgerald's How Bad Do You Want It? And like these three books together with your book, Do Hard Things, just completed this line of thought. So we talked about language, we talked about nuance, we talked about building a better vocabulary. So if you've read those other two books, then this book really helps create a more illuminating, more robust, nuanced picture of it, and actually colors and highlights some of the things both Alex and Matt touched on in their books. But what you did really well, Steve, was kind of dig a little deeper, bring a little bit more science to it, while also telling a really good narrative to make it really applicable to whatever situation you might find yourself in your day-to-day existence for yourself or for those who you work with. So yeah, that was reading it. I was just like, oh man, this is definitely a canon that has happened because those two books were great, but this book really does just like elevate the concepts that they initially presented there with you taking it to the next level.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, if you're interested, you can get it anywhere you want, Amazon, all those good things. We do have, for a limited time, if you order on launch week, all sorts of free bonus items and guides and
Ooh,
stuff.
bonuses. Love
So,
bonuses.
bonuses are always great. So if you want more, go, you can check it out. Any of my websites got links everywhere, social media. But appreciate you guys taking the time. And next week, we'll be back with our regular scheduled dive into running stuff. So take care, everyone.